I've had a change of heart, and I now truly enjoy going to the homeless shelter here in Laguna Beach, where I happen to be right now, or into the prisons. I find that is far more satisfying. Spending time with my kids. I love spending time with my granddaughter. That's my number one favorite thing to do. So there's been a change, and I chalk that up to a lot of the things that I've learned from people and mistakes others people have made in terms of self-medication, because that's all it is. Drug addiction. I'm no better than the drug addict or the alcoholic, with my workaholism. So once you kind of wake up that this is self-medication to mask a trauma, you deal with the trauma, the alcoholism, the drug addiction, the workaholism will go away. And that's part of the process I learned, going through this writing process.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We talk to a lot of different kind of guests, and we are everywhere the interweb goes and podcasts are listened to. This is a Facebook Live event, which will be recorded and available on Facebook and YouTube and through Twitter and online on our podcast in a little while. Today, I'm talking with an author who has written something very interesting to me, because it kind of reflects some of my own life experience that he's unpacking in the area of trauma. So the new book is Post-Traumatic Thriving. I've got that right, correct, Randall?
You sure do, Frank. Yes.
Yeah, and Dr. Randall Bell, PhD. Let's get the doctor part first of all. Just a little housekeeping here. What kind of a doctor?
Oh, I have a PhD in basically sociology and economics. It's socioeconomics.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because given the content of your book, it also has a lot to do in a way with psychology and stress that we all face and so on. So that there'd be a couple ways in. Before we get into the book and more about you in terms of your thinking, let's just talk a little bit on the personal front. When we talk about trauma, my first question is, well, what trauma in your life gives you a frame of reference in which this has become such a pursuit of yours? And I want to preface that by saying I'm not asking you to say things you don't feel like saying, because as a writer, I also write from a very personal point of view, whether it's my son in combat in Afghanistan as a Marine that I've written about, or my life within the evangelical subculture, which I kind of fled and moved on from, or the fact that I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18, or, that I had polio as a 2-year-old. There's a lot of places there which are very private, but at the same time, my writing would be completely ununderstandable unless I dug into some of that. So I tend to be upfront and just talk about, my own background in my books. But I wanted to ask you, before we get going on something that has trauma in the title, what your background was like. Who were your parents? Where did you grow up? And, what gives you this perspective and this interest on a personal level? Forget the academic for a while.
Yeah, really wonderful question, Frank. I grew up in Fullerton, California, which is Orange County. It's just immediately north of Disneyland. In fact, you can see Disneyland from our family's front porch. Interestingly, I grew up about 2 streets away from Leo Fender, who invented the Fender guitar. My dad worked for Fender. Wonderful parents. I had a wonderful childhood, but the trauma that, and I get your point of we don't want to air all our traumas publicly, but the trauma I do talk about publicly in the book was I was born with a congenital heart defect. And I had open heart surgery when I was 11. In fact, I was just with my cardiologist yesterday, and it looks like I need another trip to the, hospital. So that was a childhood trauma. But honestly, Frank, I wrote the book from my perspective as an economist because I studied disasters.
Sure.
Every case from the World Trade Center to O.J. Simpson and the Bikini Atoll and on and on. And I wrote the book initially kind of connecting with the people I met behind the statistics of these different cases. I wrote the book, and it had kind of, honestly, it's embarrassing to admit that it was kind of a professorial that you need to do this, you need to do that. And then I woke up and said, hey, It turns out I had PTSD from my childhood trauma. It never got resolved. It got resolved physically, but it never got resolved emotionally.
Yeah.
And so I had to rewrite the whole book and change the language that we should consider doing this, we should consider doing that, and
Yes.
take a kind of plug myself into the whole discussion like everyone else.
Yeah, I understand that. When you talk about trauma in your own life and that surgery experience and the illness and whatever fear and all the rest of it that went with it, who was supporting you during all that? I mean, obviously your family was there, but what do you remember in terms of people reaching out and helping you get through that trauma that then obviously was not resolved well enough so that you feel that you got past what has given you some PTSD from that? So just talk about who was there for you, how they succeeded in helping you and how they failed because they, in some ways left you with something unresolved.
Yeah, well, I wonderful parents. My mom's 99, she's still with us. And I think they did their best given their generational experience to comfort me, but they came from an era where you didn't talk about trauma, which is classic mistake number one with resolving trauma. So they were kind of like the suck it up buttercup kind of, mentality. The doctors, themselves were not particularly helpful. The doctors were great. They did their job. They got it fixed physically, but they patted me on the back and said, go have a great life, kid. There was no discussion of what I was going through.
Sure.
The people that really stood out to me through the whole ordeal were the candy striper, the kids my age that came through the hospital to visit and bring me French fries. I mean, I get choked up because just them showing up, they weren't there as a doctor. They weren't there as a parent. They weren't there out of any obligation. They weren't being paid, but just to sit and hang out and talk to them was really the best emotional connection I made with anyone through that time.
Besides the fact that it was a big surgical intervention, do you think there was some kind of additional psychological impact because it was your heart? And I don't mean in the sense that you had a good enough command of anatomy to know this could kill you, but it seems to me that the heart is the one thing that, use the old British literary expression, really can get in amongst you. The brain is the other one because you live there. But do you think that had, even as a child, because they were messing around with your heart, as opposed to, say, fixing your spine if you had been born with spinal bifida or whatever it might be, that sort of had a bigger impact on you in terms of any fear or just lasting anxiety that came from that?
Yeah, I think I hadn't thought of it that way until you asked that question, Frank, but I think you have a point because we do think with our heads and we do feel with our hearts, and it, no pun intended, this went right to the heart of my life.
Exactly.
That's an interesting perspective. I think it was because it's like, you take so many things for granted, and had it been I had a problem with my arm or something, I think that would have been a little more peripheral. But since it went right here, it was, it shook me up pretty good.
Yeah, it has a different effect. A couple months ago, my wife, Jeannie, we've been together for 52 years now, against all the odds. What are the odds, right? Getting together when you're teenagers. But she had a heart attack, which she's done very well with and had a stent put in. But I can just remember 7 or 8 weeks ago when this was all going on, or what a relief it was that they weren't going to open up her chest and mess with her heart. They were going to do this through a vein with the stent. Because the psychology, even there, in terms of once removed, somebody you love, the heart is a big deal.
Yeah, kind of is.
So what has been your journey since then? You're going to the cardiologist. They may want to do something again. And you said that you came away with some PTSD. What has that left you with in terms of just your own physical situation, but how you look at these things now? So when you hear from a cardiologist, they may need to do more. What does that kind of trigger in you, if anything?
Well, I have a wonderful cardiologist, and a few years ago I visited her and I said I've been invited by some buddies to go hike Mount Kilimanjaro. And so she put me on the treadmill to kind of see, how everything was. Yeah. And I'd already had another cardiologist. She was in a second opinion. The first opinion was you need surgery. And she said, you know what, your condition is actually mild. It's a heart valve, so it's not nearly what I underwent as a kid. But as I stood on the treadmill, she plugged it in. She hadn't even started the treadmill. I was just simply standing there, and my heart rate was 150 beats per second, which is double what it should be.
Right.
And that was a big red flag to her and to me that I was suffering from PTSD, because my cardiologist as a child was also a woman. And so in my adult brain now, I was kind of reliving that stress, that unresolved trauma, if you will, and it all came back. And so we had a conversation about meditation. We had a conversation about all kinds of things to address the PTSD. And that's where I had to really reach out and get some help in that department. Frankly, and fortunately, through the techniques I explain in the book, it's all been resolved. I was with her yesterday. My heart rate, my blood pressure when I met with her was completely healthy and normal. But that was through some real work and some techniques that she taught me.
Yeah, I was going to say, did she point you in the direction of the work that was helpful?
Well, she did more than that. She taught at night. She teaches a class on meditation. She's a very holistic doctor. And through, I went plant-based in my eating. I started meditating regularly, more exercise. She gave me the green light. I did hike Kilimanjaro while they were taking 30-year-olds down on stretchers. My 3 old friends and me made it to the summit. And I was just talking to her about yesterday about in October, we plan on going to Mount Everest and doing the base camp. So, you know, the techniques really work is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's great. Well, hey, parenthetically, aren't we both lucky to have wonderful women doctors?
We sure are, because the guy I met with first, he just wanted to, you know, kick it into the operating room, and, you know, it wasn't very holistic.
Yeah, no, it's really wonderful. You know, I'm a big proponent of female leadership in all fields, and I've been fortunate that I've fallen on my feet with medical care from some wonderful women doctors. My GP's been a woman for the last 22 years, same woman down at Mass General here in Massachusetts. And I always feel very fortunate about that. Anyway, moving on now. Let's get to the book a second. Mine is an electronic copy. Do me a favor and hold it up here. Let's just look at the cover.
Yeah, I got it in front of me. It's there it is.
Yes. Okay. Post-traumatic thriving. And who's the publisher?
It's published by Core IQ. It's a nonprofit.
Okay, good. So and the reason I ask about the publisher is it is available everywhere books are available, as in people can order this, I'm imagining, from anywhere one orders books.
Oh yeah, it's on Amazon. Honestly, we're a little behind because I got COVID last year. I don't want to bore you with that, but it knocked me out for 6 months.
Yeah.
And so the audio version's not out. The hardback version's not out, but the electronic version and the paperback is
good.
out.
Yeah, and that's where we got ours. So what I wanted to say was, you just note something for people watching, that we're talking to Dr. Randall Bell, who's the author of post-traumatic thriving, and the links to you, Dr. Bell, your book, anything you want us to link you to, people to, will all be with this everywhere we put it. We have a lot of different platforms. It'll be on all of them. So my wonderful producer, Ernie, will stay on with you afterwards and make sure that we've got all the details of what you would like people to chase down when they want to get in touch with you and talk to you or invite you to speak or whatever it might be.
Right.
So that said, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm with Dr. Randall Bell. Let's get into one subject that my producer and I were kicking around before we started talking here, and that is kind of right up to the moment, the shock of the trauma of the pandemic on a kind of a national you know, psyche, you could put it that way, that we're all still in, and we've all had different experiences of it. You've had COVID, so, you know, for you, it's very direct and personal, but talk about that a little bit in the light of how your book applies to this situation. You've done with a lot of crisis, you know, the Master of Disaster title goes with you. Okay, this is a disaster of epic proportions globally. However you slice it, how does this translate through your grid of what your analytical tools are for post-traumatic thriving and your tools for dealing with things? So just riff for a while, if you would, on the fallout from COVID in our individual lives and then as a nation and then globally. How do you see this thing?
Yeah, well, Frank, the bad news is, COVID has just, cleaned our clocks in so many ways and so many layers of that, not just, health wise, I personally dealt with, and millions of others have as well. It's also just the fear and trepidation of touching a doorknob. This is kind of a chronic trauma. And then you've got, it's getting pretty close to home because people I know have lost, siblings, have died. So it's a very real thing. It is what it is. And then you have it's layered trauma, which not only that, you have the financial trauma, the economic trauma, the social trauma, kids wearing masks and not being kids and playing on the playground, and kids, bored out of their brains, sitting around without going to school. So on every level you can think of, this pandemic's been a problem. That's the really bad news. And then later on top of that, we still got the other issues of the cars breaking down and the auto accidents and losing a job and other illnesses. And it's just really a profound problem. But here's the good news, Frank, is that whether it's COVID or in the middle of a trauma or any of these other layered traumas, the solutions are remarkably similar. And this isn't according to me. I've gone and done the academic research and pulled this together. So I want to give attribution to great minds out there that have come up with this. So right in chapter 1, I want to give people some skills to, take the blood pressure down and start dealing with this more effectively. I learned these 2 techniques in of all places, San Quentin Prison, where I work as a volunteer. And I want to give the IPP program credit for that. Number 1 is, we call it in prison, we call it sitting in the fire. That's where you cannot suffer alone. Trauma recovery is never a solo experience. As a kid, I never talked about it. The doctors, my parents really never talked to me about what I was going through, and that didn't have happy consequences. You got to find somebody, whether it's a therapist preferably, or a trusted friend or a family member, where you can have those very real conversations and talk about it. And you sometimes talking about trauma, you sound like a broken record because you gotta get it all out. So that's sitting in the fire. That's technique number 1. The second one is we call it in prison, we call it grounding, which is really meditative, deep breathing practices. It all comes, of course, out of Buddhism. But Sarah Lazar out of near you in Harvard Medical School, she's published at least a dozen articles showing the brain scans scientifically correlating to healthier brains and healthier neurology. So deep breathing exercises, you can call it yoga, you can call it Lamaze, you can call it meditation. I don't care what you call it, but those practices have profound effects. Those 2 alone will really help us deal with this pandemic. And I try to do it every day, at least, sometimes twice a day, or just in the elevator, taking 10 deep breaths really kind of calms the nervous system. There's the whole parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system, physiology we could talk about. But what it's actually doing, it's literally lowering the blood pressure, backing off the adrenaline secretions, and letting us heal. So that's kind of the big picture, and that's the bad news and the good news.
Let me jump back a little bit in your own history in terms of just experiences where you have tried to put some of this into effect. And my question here is going to be, how much were you trying to put into effect what you're talking about in the book when you had something to do with the recovery process from the World Trade Center or the Flight 93 crash, these other traumatic things, Hurricane Katrina? First of all, give us a little documentary run through of, when these things come up, how were you involved? Why were you involved? What did you learn? And then was your thinking on recovery from trauma, as, if I can put it this way, together as it is now in this book then, or were you still developing your ideas?
I was developing my ideas, with these, like, you go to Hurricane Katrina, and my role was to compute economic damages. I don't know if you heard about the Porter Ranch methane leak in LA, but I've been working on that. We just got that settled for 1.8 billion. So they're very big cases, very serious. But but behind the statistics and behind the dollar signs are real people whose lives were really, train wrecked as a consequence of these various, environmental and natural disasters and everything else. And the World Trade Center, of course, a terrorist attack. So I had this privilege of getting kind of a backstage pass and meeting the people behind the statistics. And I don't know what it was, Frank, but I just felt I don't know if it's a word that is connection, but I felt really fascinated with the people I was meeting, because I noticed that some people were traumatized, and then you talk to them a year or two later. A lot of these cases, some of the cases, the Bikini Atoll went for 7 years, so you get to know these people pretty well. Some people died; they never recovered, and I don't mean that as a self-righteous thing. It's just a factual observation that they were angry, they were depressed, and they never really recovered. And I felt so bad for them. Other people, and I call that the dive stage. And then, Frank, the second
is interrupt you there. Did they die because of the trauma, in the sense that left untreated with the methods that you're talking about here, it exacerbated a physical condition that killed them? Or did they die they ran out of time before they were able to deal with these issues?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The word I'm using is dive, D-I-V-E.
Oh, dive. I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. And I'm thinking of all those first responders at the World Trade Center that died and so forth.
But people, they don't die, but they dive in the sense that they stay depressed and they stay angry.
I get it. I get it.
Yeah. So, and then I also noticed there was a segment of the folks I was meeting and getting to know that got into the survive stage, where they got their lives back, they got their homes back, they kind of recreated what they had before the trauma, and they were very happy with that. And I was very happy for them. And that's a big accomplishment. But the segment that I was really just enthralled with were the thrive stage. So we go dive, survive, thrive. The thrivers, it's as if they tapped into the energy of the trauma, because let's face it, there's a lot of energy, but they kind of repurposed that energy into something and did something really remarkable, something they never would have done, absent the trauma. I was fascinated by this segment of society that go through the hard knocks and not only get back on their feet, but they just take off and they're doing new remarkable things. So as I'm working a lot of these cases, I'm just kind of a sponge, trying to be kind, trying to be helpful, trying to do my job and get, the financial compensation, but just keenly observant of those who kind of fit into the dive, survive, or thrive mode, and paying attention to what those who were thriving, what they did, and documented it for this book.
Do you think that what you talk about in the book, and we'll get into the stories, I hope, of a couple of those folks who were thriving, do you think that people who are not predisposed to thrive for whatever reason, they approach it wrong, or their own background, or their limitations of the way they think about it, whatever it might be, emotional trauma too deep, if they had your book as sort of a first response to their situation, are there some people who are just stuck and they are not going to thrive? Or are there people who, by function of how they would, say, respond to counseling you would give them directly or through your book, could turn it around?
Yeah, I wrote the book as a roadmap, a blueprint to help people process this more effectively. It's still going to hurt. There's no magical pills. There's nothing like that. But if you have a blueprint and you're inspired by people, because the science in the book, there's a lot of science, a lot of academics, but there's also stories of about 12 people that have actually applied these techniques. They got really knocked down hard and are now doing today remarkable things. So through the inspiration and the stories and the science, my effort is to create a blueprint so people can say, you know what, they did it. I'm inspired. Here are the techniques. I'm going to do them, and I can move through this process more effectively. And instead of taking 10 years to get back on my feet, maybe it only takes 2. And there's some efficiency about the whole process.
Were the people you found that were thriving in their post-traumatic comeback, as it were, doing so because even if they had never heard of you or these theories, they had stumbled into the truth of what you're writing about in their own way, or were these people that you reached out to and helped who otherwise would have been in a different position?
Yeah, I don't know that I was much help, other than what I was good at, Frank, is I would sit down, shut up, and listen. I was really good at that. I remember I was in the Bikini Atoll area, and the little group of us that were on this island that hadn't been stepped on in, I think, 50 years since the nuclear tests. I saw a man down the sandy beach all by himself, and I thought, you know, I don't know, I was just drawn to go say hello to the guy, and I did. And we sat down on a coconut tree log, and he told me a story about the day he described it as two suns coming up. One sun was, of course, the real sun, and the other one was the mushroom cloud from a nuclear test, you know, across the lagoon. And he talked about that night how his daughter and all the kids in the village were spinning around in this gray fallout. They thought it was like snow and playing in it. His daughter went to Bethesda, Maryland, where she passed away, and it just ripped my heart out, because I've got a daughter, and I couldn't imagine what he's going through. Well, it was more observation, because this gentleman, I followed his story for 7 years as I worked through the case. He was really the driving force. While he was a very quiet, mild-mannered island person, a local person, he was the driving force in terms of pushing forward, where we got a $2 billion lawsuit. You can't bring back his daughter, sadly, but you can give some compensation for just the mess that was made by that nuclear testing program. So it was more observation. I wasn't there to, you know, show up and say, you know, I'm here to, you know, save the day. I was more there to just shut up and listen and absorb, document it. And then when I had this wisdom, you know, frankly, provided to me by very, you know, wonderful people like this, I wrote the book. That's all I had to do with it.
Well, in post-traumatic thriving, what would be the range of readers? You know, when I write, I kind of get into a project. I'm not one of these people that pictures the marketing first. You know, that's always a sign of a problem in a book. Like somebody who wants to write a book and says, how do you get an agent before they've written anything? You know, this is not a good indication that they're going to do any good work. But once I'm into a project and I start editing it, then I start saying, who's my reader? So it can be a person. I can picture that person and say, okay, how would she take this? And that's very helpful. But when I think of your book, I'm thinking of the range of trauma that we go through in life. And you know, you're talking about these huge cases, 9/11, and you know, the atoll that becomes the testing ground for a nuclear program half a century ago or more. But then, of course, in daily life, you know, looking how we're getting through the COVID pandemic, or even the death of a loved one or something else, we face these mini traumas that, of course, for us as individuals, are also the end of the world. Mm-hmm. So it may not be a nuclear explosion or a massive terrorist attack, but you know, you talk to someone who's had a huge loss or something terrible happens to a child, you know, you're saying you're a father. What is the range, if you could say, who your readers are across that board of big calamity versus individual loss? Well, you work with prisoners, so you're working with individuals who have lost their freedom and who live in terrible conditions. So you're dealing with individuals too.
Yeah, it's them. The statistics are that by college age, 66 to 85% of the population has suffered through or been impacted by a trauma. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of people. The book is more specifically targeted to those who are lingering in it and are not successfully moving beyond it. You know, you go through the first chapters and there's the shock and the denial and the anger and that normally and all expected normal processes, but some people land in depression and frequently do. And depression is normal. If it goes on for 2 or 3 months, totally normal. Some people move on from that. They don't need my book. But for those who are lingering there longer than 2 or 3 months and really kind of having a hard time moving on with a happier, more productive life, they need these tools, whether they get them here or somewhere else. that's who the target is, those who are having that struggle.
Would you be talking to those readers directly with post-traumatic thriving, or would you be talking to them as well via counselors, pastors, professionals, psychologists who read your book and maybe get something out of your experience that they hadn't gotten from their own fields of academic study or theology or spirituality? Is this also a handbook for those who give care, as well as for a person, sort of the direct receiver of the message?
Yeah, I am not a psychologist, so I'm not qualified to do that. And I don't do that other than, informally, I'm happy to listen to people's stories, when that opportunity arises. But yeah, it's both for the person going through it and a handbook for the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the pastors, the rabbis, whoever might be confronting that, to help people, give them practical tools. They're not difficult, they're simple, but they're powerful. And again, give this blueprint for, helping all of us kind of move through this stuff.
When you talk about the stories you tell in the book, the 12 stories, can you give us a thumbnail of those 12 stories, and then maybe pick one or two, as you did with the person on the atoll there who brought that big suit or was the driving force behind it, who actually lost a child? Tell us some more about those stories that are in post-traumatic thriving.
Well, I'll pick one, but it's a pretty wide range, because I have both a gentleman who was raised in poverty and ended up, being convicted of murder, and he's been paroled, and now, close to, he'll have his master's degree in May, and he's moving on to a PhD. So that's post-traumatic thriving. Then I also have, in the O.J. Simpson case, I have Tanya Brown's story from the other side of the story of losing her sister to murder. And then I've got Leo Fender, who I grew up near, and I have his story of where he had his eye out as a kid through a picket fence accident, and then he blew out his hearing with an amplifier accident, and he invented the electric guitar, and here we go. We got a billion-dollar empire. This one story is a beautiful girl I knew in high school who lost her husband to suicide. Not a headline issue, but to her that was very much a headline issue. But the story I'm going to kind of land on is I also went to high school with Jerry Jewell. You might remember Jerry from Facts of Life, from ABC sitcom, and then she just recently starred on HBO's Deadwood. She was born with cerebral palsy, and I remember her in high school because she had this physical disability.
Oh yeah, and so she was the person in Deadwood who, was cleaning up and sweeping up in the bar there.
Yeah.
And she was an actual CP kid, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. She sure was. And I had the privilege, really, of seeing Jerry and her interactions with her sister in high school and following her story through. So I sat down with Jerry Jewell, and I sat down with all these folks for hours, if not multiple days, getting their story, getting the little nuances, things they did, how they felt, what they did when they were down, what they did when they were up, and their mindset, to really get the book to come alive with Jerry was just an ordinary kid in high school with a physical disability, and she's spoken at the White House 3 times. I mean, these are real stories, real people that apply these techniques. And not only they apply these techniques, they taught me their techniques. And
so in a way, you have applied their techniques and written a book.
That's
using
more accurate.
Talk to me about her a second. She, her and all the other people, you met a guy who was standing on a beach alone. Are these all serendipitous meetings, or did you, and Fender the same? I mean, he's a neighbor, but how did you make the connections with the rest of the people you were telling their stories of?
Yeah, a lot of them are just dumb luck. I mean, some people I went to high school with, some people I met later in life, or I met through my consulting work. One time I was up in Santa Barbara, I was given a speech, and then the gentleman right after me, I was sitting there talking to him. I didn't really know his story. I just met him.
Yeah.
He got up. He was the guy. He was the Vietnam vet that came back from Vietnam and came up with the term post-traumatic stress disorder. I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe the good fortune. His story is now in the book.
And what's his name?
Shad Shadrach, and
Okay.
he lives in LA, and he started an empire with helping veterans. I mean, literally an empire.
Yes. Yeah, that's amazing. Now, when you were writing the book, what part of the process did you begin to do these interviews and conversations that turned into these little narrative stories that you have in the book to illustrate your point? And here's the point of my question that I'm fishing for. How much did you change in your own, I guess you could say, the advice column part of the book of how here are some techniques for you to deal with this? How much comes from things you had already set in stone, as it were, and how much did you change because of what these folks were telling you about what happened on the set of Deadwood, whatever it may be, however they found the thriving process in the midst of their, whether it could be a disability or something else. Mm. My dad always did a lot of counseling as a pastor. One thing I took away from him, although I've moved far away from that evangelical theology, is he always said something that actually reflected what you just said. He said, it's not what you say to people, it's the fact that you're listening in terms of helping. Mm-hmm. And obviously you're a listener. What did you hear from them? What's the proportion of what you've got in your book that came because you talked to them and discovered something, or what they were saying fit in with what you had already written?
It was a mixed bag. I mean, I hit the books hard. I am an academic, and so I don't want to just pop off with anecdotal advice, because frankly, anecdotal advice can get, compound the problem. Sure. So, I was hitting the books, but and then I was really drilling deep with these people, asking, a lot of questions. It took me 10 years to write the book. I was in no rush. Frankly, in retrospect, I think what I was really doing was addressing my own trauma from childhood. Sure. And I'm, I own that. But it was, I give credit where it's due, and I think maybe 50% science and academics and 50% stories from the folks.
Pick something out from one of the stories, one of the people you talk to, whether you've included it in the book as part of their story or not, but something that maybe comes back to mind where you're saying, wow, yeah, she really nailed that. He really nailed it. Yes, now I'm going to use that. Does something stand out like that?
Well, yeah, I was invited in another book I wrote. I was invited to give.
And what book was that?
Well, the title's Me, We, Do, Be. Me is our mindset. We is our connection with people. Do is what we do, and be is what we're becoming. So I done Me, We, Do, Be, and I got a great response. And I went out and did a Today show in New York, and I was doing another national television program, and the producer was just really wonderful. And she came out after my segment and said, I've got a trauma that I went through because her house was crushed by a landslide. And it just started popping off because she said some things that made the academic stuff that I had been reading kind of come alive, and where I connected with it because I've seen her actual application. So I asked her, I said, do you mind if I really sit down with you and your husband and interview you about this landslide? Because they had a life of luxury. They had a wonderful life. And that was the problem, that while they were enjoying this luxury, they weren't really fulfilling their dreams. Their dreams was to have a big ranch where her husband would outfit Western movies. That was his passion. That is his passion. And so I went through the journey, and as they are talking about it, it was making, like I say, a lot of this academics and the scholarly scientific stuff come alive.
No, that's interesting. Let me just interject here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is Dr. Randall Bell, who is the author of various books, but today we're talking about post-traumatic thriving. And can you just show us the cover again, in case there's somebody coming in now who hasn't seen this?
Here we go.
I just want to make sure we've got everything. Yeah. So the book came out about halfway through the pandemic, and you're saying you worked on it 8 years. So what is this? Did you start this project about 10 years ago?
Well, it was more like 12 years ago. I spent 10 years writing the book. So it's been a 12-year project.
And you've done other books, and I don't know what the copyright dates on them are, but did you have projects that came up while you were writing this, got shorter projects, or did they all take that same sort of time?
No, they took shorter. Me, we do be, I'm guessing took a couple years. I wrote a book. The title's Leo Fender. I wrote that book with Mrs. Fender because
Sure.
I was so fascinated with Leo's background, and I had this access to the Fender
Yes.
family. That was maybe a couple years. Post-traumatic thriving by far took the longest to write.
Yeah, sure. Well, it encompasses, a global global set of experiences. It's a big
Yeah.
deal. When you were writing the Fender book, by the way, did you get, as an author, sometimes I get blurbs, little comments from people that like a book from interesting places. Obviously, there's a couple musicians out there who like Fender. Did they read your book and say they liked it?
Oh yeah, Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones endorsed it, so it's had
I figured you would have. I was fishing for that, but I didn't
Yeah.
want to come out and say.
Yeah, no, we Mrs. Fender was adored. She's passed away sadly, but she was adored by country stars, rock stars.
Sure.
And I got to be her chauffeur, so it was fun.
Yeah, that's great. You would have attracted some interesting readers on that one.
Yeah.
Let me get back to you now, personally. First of all, you mentioned your daughter. Can you give me a little bit of your own post-traumatic life in the sense of how that affected your own personal family relationships and the, father connections that you had? Talk to me a little more about your own life just as an adult, irrespective of all this material. If we were sitting down on an airplane, happened to meet, and I'm telling you that I've been doing childcare for 3 of my 5 grandchildren for the last 13 years and live up the street from a son who was in Afghanistan as a Marine, and then he went off to the University of Chicago and did well there, came back, got married, settled here, figured, being shot at was enough of an adventure, and now he wanted to be close to home again. Speaking of your subject, by the way,
Mhm.
So that's all affected my life, my writing, and the rest of it. I find personal relationships are what really are, you were talking about working through your own trauma through this 10-year writing, 12-year writing process. Talk about your life other than that. I mean, who are you? What are your relationships? What matters to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've never shared this before, but I will do it. As an adult, I had another trauma, and this is a trauma which, sadly, millions of people can relate to. And I went through a really hideous divorce, really, really tough. And my daughter, it was very traumatic for her, and it really strained our relationship in really painful ways, both for her and for me. And I was very anxious to reconnect with my daughter, and all my kids were traumatized by what was going on, a situation of which they had absolutely nothing to do with. And so I used these techniques to reconnect with my daughter. Today, I have it's just, I don't know the right adjective, but a beautiful relationship with my daughter, my son-in-law, their daughter, my granddaughter. We go skiing together all the time, but it didn't come easy. It took a lot of work, a lot of figuring out, a lot of untangling what has happened here. And because before the divorce, I had a wonderful relationship with her, and I wanted that back. So, this doesn't have to be the Bikini Atoll nuclear weapons test sites. This could be something like a divorce, which I personally went through, which was horrific. But there's a happy ending to the story, and the techniques work there as well. They work for me, frankly, and I think they work for anybody who applies them.
Did you and your daughter talk about things that border on some of these techniques that you talk about in the book, or did she just sort of serendipitously find her own way back to being reconnected with you after some sort of separation over the divorce?
Yeah, I think it was maybe both, but I think there were things, I mean, the meditative practices, I'm a different person today than I was, 10, 20, years ago, because I used to be an executive at PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's the world's biggest consulting firm.
Sure, I know who they are.
Yeah, very, very aggressive, it's litigation that I work in, big dollars. And I was wound pretty tight. Through the processes of this book, I'm just different. I'm more empathetic. I am more calm. I am more understanding. I'm less prone to jumping down the throat of people that disagree with me. And so in terms of rebuilding that relationship with my daughter, I'm actively doing the work that is documented in the book. It doesn't just happen to fall from trees. It's work you got to do, but I did it.
How old was she when you guys kind of got out of each other's lives for a while?
Yeah, it was her junior and senior year in high school, which is a tough time for a young, lady to have this going on, because high school is emotional enough for kids. So that was the time.
How old is she now?
Oh, I'm guessing, I should know. I think she's 23 now.
Yeah, so it was a while back, but not in another century. I mean, I've been around the block enough, so some things happened 50 years ago. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Weird that you live long enough, so you're saying, hey, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Whoever figured you'd get to a place where you could say, speak, in a sentence, say, hey, 50 years ago, I was doing such and such, but, I'll be 70 in August. So that's a kind of a hindsight perspective on the whole thing. You were talking about changing through some of this process yourself, and you're a different guy now than you were then. When you look back at whatever it was that, this divorce became and who you were at that point, do you think if you knew now what knew then, sort of what you know now, or who you were then as you would have been now, it would have been a less horrendous experience? In the sense, I look back on things and sometimes I hate that guy. I just think to myself, basically, I have a line in my book, that I was raised as an asshole by divine right, in a theology that put men in charge of everything.
That's great.
Yeah, an asshole by divine right, because I grew up in an environment that said men are in charge. Keep those women in their place. They're supposed to be your helpmeet. I mean, it was a very bad way to go into marriage, relationships, fatherhood, whatever you name. Okay, so I look back and I don't like that guy. I have not only progressed from it, I sort of shudder. And I don't know if you've ever had experiences like that in your life. I'm not saying you were an asshole by divine right, or any other way, but I'm just saying, I look at my own trajectory and I have plenty of regret and plenty of things that I would have done differently. And like you, have spent a good deal of energy trying to repair some of the damage, both politically, because I was part of the religious right in the 70s and 80s, and how did that all work out? And then on the other hand, personally, with relationships with my children, other people, my wife, Jeannie, and so on. So I'm not on a fishing expedition for up close and personal stuff that you don't want to do, but I'm just so interested because you have such an analytical mind about trauma. And of course, the sad thing in my life is 90% of my trauma was self-inflicted. So, if I'd been a different person, I wouldn't have created the trauma for me and everybody around me. And I just wondered how you've progressed, because you've been around the block long enough to look at yourself with some distance now.
Yeah, I think I would describe myself as today as a more empathetic narcissist.
Yeah, okay.
I get your point. I don't know that had I had the mindset I do today, that there never would have been a divorce. There were other issues that were out of my control. But in terms of my relationship with my kids and my daughter, I think had I had the techniques that are in this book, I think it still would have been traumatic. It wouldn't have whitewashed or magically made all the issues disappear, but I think it would have been more effective. I did a lot of things right, but it wasn't my wisdom. I was going to a really great therapist who was saying, you should, try this and try that, luckily it only was 2 years. I've heard some people that are estranged for 20 years. So, So I think I did some things right, but it was following the advice of my book and reaching out to people that are professionals that have been through this stuff before, because frankly, I didn't know what I was doing. I large part still don't, but I look up to those who do.
Yeah, and you got some distance and some experience in that now. Has your daughter read Post-Traumatic Thriving, or have any of your kids read it?
She has read it, I think, a couple times. And then I have 3 sons, and they're more, going out with their girlfriends and having fun. But yeah, I'm not sure. They've read snippets here and there, but mostly my daughter, and I think it might have helped her too.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
When just to change gears for a minute, you were talking about being sort of a more hard driving person or in a different environment when you were at Price Waterhouse or wherever it was, right? You know, I just to change the subject completely now and just talk to you, you know, conversationally, it seems to me that one of our big problems in the States, which by the way, creates a lot of individual trauma, and I'll give you an example of it. When it comes to the balance of family and career, for instance, is that we define success in a very bad way. We define success by our job title, our position, our power over others, rather than by the quality of our relationship with the people who matter most to us. So, you know, look at our conversation here for the last 20 minutes. What are we talking about? How we might have done better on a personal relationship with somebody, how we put together the pieces because it mattered to us. Isn't it interesting that you've spent more time, at least in this conversation with me, talking about the reconstruction of a relationship with your daughter with a great deal of passion and interest, rather than telling me how successful you are and what you earned last year and we did this and we did that. You know, that kind of conversation would very quickly fall flat for a reason. And that is, as you know, it seems to me that real success in life can be measured in what we see in the eyes and the face of the people who love us and that we love. And without caregiving and receiving of care, life's pretty deadly. So what's your observation on that? Do you think in North America, you know, you brush up against billion-dollar settlements and all this business, but in the final analysis, what that guy was all about on the beach was that he had lost a daughter. The rest doesn't make sense. I mean, who cares about the billions? It's like, it all comes down to that. So what's your, you know, you're sitting there near Disneyland, you grew up, you know all these successful people. Surely in the stories they tell, the sort of deathbed account, if you want to get melodramatic, it's not about their success. It's about who they were as people and how they related to the people they loved. How do you see that?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of what real success looks like. I mean, I made a lot of classic mistakes, and my workaholism, which landed me in, you know, PricewaterhouseCoopers and on all that stuff, was really self-medication, you know, to cover up particularly the unresolved trauma of the surgery I went through as a kid, and maybe some others traumas. But you're right. Where the rubber meets the road are those close relationships. And I've got clients today who are billionaires, and some of them are just, you know, quintessential, stereotypical billionaires that it's all about money. And it's like, how many houses do you need, dude? I mean, seriously. And some of them are the most salt of the earth, down to earth people that drive old beat up red trucks, you know, pickup trucks, and would give you the shirt off their back. So it has nothing to do with the materialistic thing. It has to do where, you know, really where your heart is and those connections with people that are close to you. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I'm wagering, because I've known some successful folks too on the money side of things over my lifetime, and some folks in the political arena and entertainment and so forth. I don't want to sound like a preacher here, but it seems to me that I wouldn't be stretching the truth to say that I'll bet you that the happier billionaires that you know, or quote unquote successful people, are the ones who have worked harder at and have an idea of what success is that really reflects their relationships more than the money, because I've never known anybody where the money itself has made them happy.
Well, yeah, amen to that. I haven't either. And I had a big change there too, in terms of the big house and the cars and all the stuff. I genuinely, I've had a change of heart, and I now truly enjoy going to the homeless shelter here in Laguna Beach, where I happen to be right now, or into the prisons. I find that is far more satisfying. Spending time with my kids. I love spending time with my granddaughter. That's my number one favorite thing to do. So there's been a change, and I chalk that up to a lot of the things that I've learned from people and mistakes others people have made in terms of self-medication, because that's all it is. Drug addiction. I'm no better than the drug addict or the alcoholic, you know, with my workaholism. So once you kind of wake up that this is self-medication to mask a trauma, you deal with the trauma, the alcoholism, the drug addiction, the workaholism will go away. And that's part of the process I learned, you know, going through this writing process.
Yeah, it's funny looking back, you know, at my own life, I find, and you may have experienced this too, that one of the weirder things when you get a little bit older, as I have, is realizing that some of the best things that ever happened to me were things that seemed like failures at the time. And I'm not talking about some sort of Pollyanna, sort of Oprah-esque moment of whatever. I'm talking about literally, for instance, I was in the B end of the movie making business. I directed 4 Hollywood features. I wanted to crack into the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. It would have been an absolute disaster. And it's too long to go into why, but just in terms of how I would have handled it. You're talking about your workaholism. Mine was sort of the worship of success in that field. And, if you want to go into a field where if you're worshiping success and you sell your soul, bad things happen, the movie business is kind of it, amongst others.
I have literally, Frank, I'm not kidding you. I've gotten calls from at least 100 TV production companies. I've had 4 sizzle reels, including from big networks and all that. But I won't, they want me to monetize and exploit these cases I've worked on and make them bigger and bloodier and focus on all the drama. Sure. I'm not going to do it. I'd rather be boring and
playing with your granddaughter.
And play with my granddaughter than sell my soul on that kind of BS. So yeah, so I get it.
Yeah, you can see why I was glad for some failure there. And, my wife finally Jeannie said to me, 20 some years ago, why are you making all these crappy stories that you hate? And you say you'd never even pay to go see this movie. When the stories you tell our kids around the kitchen table are so much better. And, that's when I started writing novels. And of course, that's not the razzle dazzle fast track, but the fact of the matter is I never would have gotten there if the other had worked. So this half-assed stupid career ambition I had, thank God it worked badly enough so that I was ready to see something better. Anyway, that's just an example, but I think the same thing in sort of, it seems to me the wiser people I know run out of steam on the workaholism and chasing the money and start doing what you're talking about, which is enjoying their granddaughter or some form thereof,
Yeah. Well said.
So hold your book up. I just want people, again, let's do a little commercial break for the book, Post-Traumatic Thriving. Can you just tell me the proportion of the book that is on the sort of to-do aspect? Is that how, talk about that in terms of what people can walk away with that can help them in their individual struggles with trauma?
Well, part of the book is to do. The proportion, there's really about 8 points that in terms of to do. It's really more understanding the physiology. I mean, working with the prisoners, when you understand the mechanics of how the brain works, when there's a trigger, what triggers are, the secretions from the brain, the amygdala, the adrenaline, when you understand the physiology, it actually helps resolve the trauma because you're understanding that what I'm going through is totally normal. And this is what's going on in my body. When you become more aware of that and the breathing, then you're better equipped to take the steps to control your breathing and not react to the triggers the way that somebody else might react to them. So it's a mix between the stories, the scientific explanations, and about 8 techniques. Again, all simple, very powerful. And I mentioned the 2, sit in the fire and grounding. Sure. So, I mean, it's
the grounding, you have some grounding exercises in it as well.
Oh yeah. And then I've got also, I'll mention to you, Frank, I've got lots of mind maps where I explain the concepts. These come from my experiences with jury exhibits where I show I've got, a couple dozen of these things that can take a whole book and condense it into one exhibit. So there's a lot of effort.
Yeah, because when you go into a court case as a witness on some of these things, what did they bring you in as? I mean, you know how it is. You're not a doctor of medicine, you're a doctor of something else. But when you're the expert witness and you're part of one of those cases, who are you there as?
I'm there as an economist, and I'm the one that computes the damage. So you have the environmental engineers come in, they talk about how dirty it is, and all the percipient witnesses that experience the trauma or whatever the situation was. But I'm the guy that comes in last and says, here's what your damages are. The dollar.
Here's what it cost you.
Yeah, courts don't award hugs or apologies. They award dollars, and I've got to compute them.
Yeah, well, when you compute those damages, obviously some of your computation is non-economic. It's like, how do you compute my daughter died of radiation poisoning?
Well, and believe it or not, as crass as this sounds, again, the courts only award dollars. So, you know, a lot of these are horrible situations emotionally, but it's got to be translated into a dollar figure. That's what the courts and the juries are there to award.
Yeah. Well, let me just tell everybody again that I was talking to Randall Bell today. His book, Post-Traumatic Thriving, is available. And, you know, we have a lot of people who watch this podcast who come out of some sort of trauma from a weird religious background. They were raised in cults. They left. Their families don't speak to them anymore. You know, Orthodox Jews in New York who don't even learn English and aren't educated as women because their little Hasidim is very, very restrictive, or you know, folks who grew up in an evangelical background where they were living in a little commune like I was, who leave, and there go all your family connections. There are big traumas in surviving a breakup with family, as you know, but also with your whole community if you walk away from something that you were raised in. And I don't know why, maybe because partly my story and they've read some of my books, but I have a lot of people who follow what we do who are in that. And it seems to me in reading your book, weird as it sounds, that post-religious trauma is effectively addressed in your book through your exercises. Does that sound like a stretch to you? Because I don't think it is.
Well, it's actually not a stretch at all. This is the first time again I've ever brought this up, but I was raised in a high demand religious group, of which I still have family and friends in, and I've transitioned. So I never mention, I mention the concept of you know, cults, or I wouldn't call what I came from a cult, because I worked on the Heaven's Gate cult. That's what I would call a cult. Excuse me, but yeah, there's religious trauma, and there's also trauma from being in certain unhealthy self-help groups.
Sure.
Or multi-level marketing can get kind of crazy too. There's a lot of dimensions. So yeah, the trauma recovery techniques work for that issue as well. No
yeah,
question.
because when I was reading through it, I had Dr. Marlene Winnell on, who's a psychologist, expert in this field, and dealt with a lot. And what's interesting is that I was thinking, yeah, Marlene ought to see this book too, because a lot of what she says about recovery in what you might call post fundamentalist trauma, whether it's marketing or Christian religion or whatever it may be, you know, you were part of a cultic mentality. Now you're breaking out. Yeah. I think your book is great for that, amongst many other applications. So listen, let me just say again, this is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Dr. Randall Bell is author of Post-Traumatic Thriving. I urge you to get the book. There will be links to everything he has talked about here, his book, how to get it, him, on all the sites where this is posted. So please get the book, please get in touch with him. And if you liked this podcast in the sense of just, hey, I liked it, then please like it, quote unquote, the way we do on the interwebs to make things go. And Randall, I hope that you are able to share this with folks too, because I think, you know, your answers on these questions have just been great. And I would love people who are following you to get a chance to look at this as well. So thank you.
Well, Frank, thank you. I appreciate the conversation. You've penetrated into areas I've never gone, and I really appreciate that. And thank you again.
Well, much love to you, if I can put it that way, and to your daughter and to your granddaughter. We got a little taste of that family connection, and, you know, blessings on your tribe, sir.
Well, thank you, and love to write back to you, Frank. I really appreciate all the great work you're doing.
Thank you.